Breaking nuclear news. Let's dive right into the price action of uranium stocks on the week. The Sprott Uranium Miners ETF was flat, down 0.25% on the week, where the broader market was up 1%. But let's step back a little bit to a month. Sprott Uranium Mining ETF was up 24%, and the S&P 500 was up 7.89%. That tells you everything you need to know about how the market is valuing these assets. And so let's first talk about the underlying fundamentals. Let's go through some of these think pieces. This is from S&P Global Market Intelligence. Uranium industry set for record year of term contracting amid supply deficit. This is how the uranium spot price moves with term contracting, long-term contracts that the nuclear power plants make to acquire uranium supply. This comes from Paladin Energy Limited CEO. A massive disruption hit nuclear fuel supplies following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which mines 6% of the world's raw uranium in 2020. As uranium prices climb to a decade high, Paladin is prepared to restart the Langer mine in Namibia by the first quarter of 2020. This is the beauty of uranium. Even though we're in a massive supply deficit, it's going to take at least a year and a half to get some of the miners online. It takes so much time to get these miners back online and put supply back into the market. So the supply disruption is here to stay, and it's sticky. While industry veterans say uranium prices need to rise even more to entice widespread mine restarts or capital-intensive mine builds, Purdy observed a strong increase in both term and spot pricing this year. Absolutely massive. This is what everyone has been waiting for. Term contracting volumes are on the rise. What held back the uranium industry for the last decade was a lack of term contracting, which has been well below consumption since 2013. Utilities have been living off stockpiles, but in an environment of rising prices and shrinking secondary supplies, particularly out of Russia, this is no longer a viable option, and we're set for a record year of term contracting. Trade tech has increased the deficits it sees going forward from the prior year's estimates, the CEO said. The current primary uranium supply, including all the restarts like Langer Heinrich, is insufficient to meet consumption, not only today, but into the future. There is an annual average deficit of some 40 million pounds per annum out for the next decade. Again, you have the Wall Street firms like the Sprott Physical Trust and Yellowcake PLC and even Kazatomprom hoarding the physical supply to sell out at higher prices. So just causing this deficit to be worse. But I can't stress enough, even after Paladin starts up this mine, even after all the restarts, it's not enough. There's an annual average deficit of some 40 million pounds per year for the next decade. If you take away anything from this, please take away that. In an environment where nearly 500 reactors are currently operated or under construction, nuclear energy accounts for almost half of the U.S.'s carbon-free electricity generation. Here is a chart out from the Office of Nuclear Energy. Fast facts on nuclear energy. You can see how much of our clean power is being generated. The other ones just are not cutting it, and they can't fill in the gap. That's where nuclear comes in. That's why it's revolutionary. It's extremely dense and everyone needs it. Paladin announcing a return to production has opened the door for the company to have bilateral talks with customers given booming demand. The Ukraine conflict has disrupted the market for enriched material, which is occupying a lot of attention among utilities. We see that cascading down to uranium supplies, particularly with utilities now questioning their ability to get secure supply from Kazakhstan and other jurisdictions that are affected by the Russian conflict. And in case you're wondering how this war in Ukraine is going, Putin masses more Russian forces for a new onslaught on Ukraine. Long convoys are gathering again, say NATO intelligence, as Kiev braces for fresh offensive in the south as part of bloody war of attrition. Unfortunately, this is not going anywhere, and the supply disruptions will absolutely continue. Now, in the meantime, you have another obviously bullish headline for the uranium and nuclear industry out of Bloomberg. Manchin deal tosses $30 billion lifeline to U.S. nuclear reactors. Tax credit for nuclear power included in Senate spending bill. Incentive could save as much as 38% of fleet, analyst says. We talked about this last week. The new bill is going to include massive benefits for the nuclear industry. The U.S. government wants in on nuclear. So obviously adoption is going to increase in the United States. And this is slated for a Senate vote this week. Between 22% and 38% of the nation's nuclear fleet of 93 reactors is at risk of retiring in the 2030s, depending on natural gas prices, which we know are spiking. According to an analyst by Uranium Group, the nuclear provision is expected to keep much, if not all of that at-risk capacity on the grid, says Ben King, an associate director at the independent research firm. This is really important to continuing progress for decarbonization of the grid. Now, because of all the bullish news and fundamentals that we've been covering, you have headlines like this out of CNBC. Nuclear power is on the brink of a $1 trillion resurgence, but one accident anywhere could stop that momentum. There's a lot to unpack in this one headline. $1 trillion resurgence. It's on the brink of that. And they're saying one accident anywhere could stop that momentum. If you guys just go back and look at prior videos, you can see how we've compared nuclear power to every other energy industry. And it's literally the safest. I think wind might be slightly safer, but solar isn't. If you just look at the hours of power generation and how very, very, very few casualties there have been, it is one of the safest. And so people use air travel all the time because the odds of an accident are so extremely small. Well, the odds of a nuclear accident are extremely small as well. So we get to focus on this $1 trillion resurgence. It does not get any bigger than that. Demand for advanced nuclear reactors will be worth about $1 trillion globally, according to Secretary Granholm at the Department of Energy. The IAEA has moved quite fast from almost an intruder into a very welcome participant in this dialogue about decarbonizing the energy grid, said Rafael Grossi, the Director General of Internal Atomic Energy Agency. But that momentum depends on international cooperation out of the world, safety and best practices. The issue how nuclear industry works and is perceived globally. Any accident anywhere is an accident everywhere. We obviously have to talk about that. We are objective at this channel. So we absolutely have to talk about the risks to this investment. Moscow-Kiev exchange accusations after Ukrainian nuclear plant shelled. So the beauty of nuclear is that if you have one anywhere near your country's borders, there's no higher priority than keeping that safe. And so you do have some military activity going on around this one. But Russia and Ukraine on Friday accused each other of shelling a nuclear power plant, the biggest of its kind in Europe. Both of these countries do not want this to happen. They're going to do everything they can to avoid it. I will say that these plants have a lot of fail-safes built into them in the event of an external accident. So much money and research has been poured into keeping these things safe. Now, after all this, Ukraine State Nuclear Power Company earlier said the plant was operational and no radioactive discharges had been detected. 2 of the 6 reactors are still operating. You would think they would just shut it down for the sake of keeping everything around it safe. Now, this story bears watching. I don't know if this situation is going to derail the massive investment going on into this crucial fuel source around the world, the United States, China, every other huge country, the UK, Germany doing a U-turn. I don't think a war in Ukraine or an accident or a scare is going to necessarily derail all that investment because nuclear energy is such a crucial fuel source, but it's worth monitoring, and we will continue to do that. In the meantime, we have this from the National Review. Let's go nuclear. Nuclear energy produces energy through nuclear fission and therefore emits no carbon. This also removes pollutants from the air that cause maladies, including lung cancer and cardiovascular disease. Contrary to popular belief, nuclear energy is the safest energy source. That speaks volumes. We've gone through the data again. Even though there's a war going on in Europe, nuclear energy is the safest energy source. It provides 20% of America's electrical generation, more than 70% of non-greenhouse gas emitting electrical generation in the US. Wind farms and solar farms require 360 and 75 times more land area, respectively, than nuclear plants do. Moreover, nuclear energy produces little waste. All the nuclear waste produced in the US since the late 1950s could fill a football field about 10 yards high. Nuclear energy also has the highest capacity factor of any energy source, generating maximum energy 92.5% of the time, compared to 35.4% of the time for wind and 24.9% of the time for solar. Just as important as its environmental benefits, the nuclear industry employs almost 500,000 Americans and adds around $60 billion to the U.S. gross domestic product every year. So you can't argue with the math supporting nuclear energy. It is absolutely undeniable. It is absolutely crucial. Nuclear energy is best for North Carolina. This comes from the Carolina Journal. In June, North Carolina's Governor Roy Cooper signed House Bill 951. This law requires the NC Utilities Commission, the regulatory agency that oversees energy production, to cut carbon dioxide emissions by 70% from Duke power plants in the next 8 years. So now you have this great pivot away from coal sources. Laws are being passed to force it. North Carolina will need to take an all of the above approach toward clean energy future, and nuclear energy can lead the way in achieving our climate goals. Nuclear is clean zero emission technology that other alternatives currently cannot. Wind and solar are now subject to too many environmental variables, making them a necessary but insufficient power source. To prevent rolling blackouts like the ones we've seen in Texas, North Carolina must further invest in nuclear energy as a primary source of electricity generation. Opponents of nuclear energy, including those in North Carolina, often cite health and safety concerns. The horrific images of Chernobyl and Fukushima dominate our imaginations of nuclear energy, despite overwhelming evidence that nuclear power is a safe and clean energy source. Regarding death rates per unit of electricity generation, nuclear power is one of the safest options, even compared to hydropower. Fossil fuels and biomass, just went over this. Nuclear energy results in 99.9% fewer deaths than coal power, which is just as safe as solar and wind. Advancements in small modular reactors are only making nuclear energy safer and addressing the financial and logistical concerns that large nuclear reactors often face. So this is part of that early stage revolutionary technology coming in to innovate and proliferate this revolutionary energy source even more than people are already pricing in and understanding. So we have this from CNBC. According to the International Energy Agency, nuclear is responsible for roughly 10% of global electricity generation. Noting that nuclear power has big upfront costs and long lead times, the Paris-based organization says it has trouble in some jurisdictions competing against more economic and faster to install alternatives, such as natural gas or modern renewables. However, this is where the revolutionary integration of new technology comes into play. The development of next generation installations like modular plants could help redress this balance. In addition, the IEA describes nuclear power plants as helping contribute to electricity security by keeping power grids stable and complementing decarbonization strategies, since to a certain extent they can adjust their output to accommodate demand and supply shifts. The need for this will only grow as more renewable sources like wind and solar, which are intermittent, come online in the years to head. I think that paints a very clear picture of where we are going. We have a wall of money coming into the space. We have revolutionary technology innovating to proliferate nuclear energy further than anyone has even realized. We have mass adoption. We have favorable politics. We have the safest energy source in the world based on math and statistics. Obviously, no investment is risk-free, but the risk reward here looks pretty favorable when you're just looking at the probabilities, which all great investors do. We will cover the macroeconomic situation tomorrow as we go through the most mind-blowing macroeconomic charts of the week to figure out where all risk assets are headed. We know uranium stocks are correlated to other risk assets. in the meantime. And so we want to stay on top of the macroeconomic picture, but we will continue to stay on top of this market and cover the emerging nuclear renaissance.